Welcome to World History. Today we're going to give just the briefest overview over the American Revolution and the War for Independence. So, here are the things you need to know. You need to be able to understand what caused the war, the reasons for conflict between England and their colonies. You need to evaluate how the United States dealt with some early challenges to the Republic after independence, and then identify the accomplishments of the Washington administration, which would set the tone for the next approximate century of American history. So, let's kick off our story by talking about the British North American colonies. Hopefully, as you remember from your middle school classes, the colonies were divided up into three regions: New England, which was founded for primarily religious reasons; the southern colonies, which eventually set up plantations and had an entrenched system of slavery, growing first tobacco and then later cotton; and then the middle colonies, which were a hodgepodge and a variety of different things. Some of them, like Pennsylvania, set up for religious reasons, or some of them, like New York, set up to make money. So all of these colonies were incredibly diverse, and although they all came from England, they all developed separately. And really, the only thing that they had in common is they were all pretty much universally aggressive towards Native Americans, pushing them off their land and creating conflict. The thing that changed the relationship between England and their colonies was the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was known as the French and Indian War in the United States, and it was fought over control of the Ohio River Valley. Colonists like George Washington wanted to expand into the Ohio River Valley, but at this time, the Ohio River Valley was controlled by both Native American tribes and the French. And so the English and their native allies fought against the French and their native allies, and the end result, of course, the English won and took control of the Ohio River Valley, but they had a series of problems with the Native Americans who were still settled there. And so they tried to keep settlers, to keep colonists out of the Ohio River Valley because they didn't want to fight the Native Americans who were still living there. But the colonists, of course, ignored this and continued to settle. And so one of the sources of conflict was whether or not the Ohio River Valley should be settled by the English. The other source of conflict was how they were going to pay for this war, because the war, although it was won by England, was incredibly expensive. And so we started to see the British try to pass taxes on the colonies on things like paper, as in the Stamp Act, or tea, as in the Tea Act. And the colonists, of course, resented these taxes because they felt like they had no control over the British government that was passing them. And so this led to a series of protests, which sometimes turned violent, like the Boston Massacre, and eventually led to open warfare between colonial militias and British troops. As this fighting intensified, eventually the American colonists decided to declare independence. And a war with Britain then picked up and expanded. The American War for Independence is, of course, very complicated, has a whole bunch of different fronts, and we don't have time to get into it here. But just very briefly, the colonists fought a series of guerrilla campaigns until they could find places that were favorable for them to strike back against the British. The two most important of these places was the Battle of Saratoga, in which a British army was destroyed marching down from Canada, and the Battle of Yorktown, where another British army was trapped by General Washington and a French fleet. After these two defeats, the British decided that it was not worth continuing to fight, and they decided to recognize American independence, and just like that, the United States was now its own independent country. After independence, there were a series of arguments amongst Americans about what their government should be like. The original government of the colonies was known as the Articles of Confederation, and it was a very weak central government, which makes sense because the colonists were, of course, worried about the new government becoming tyrannical the same way that they saw England being oppressive. There were some attempts by the colonial army to make George Washington a dictator, sort of like what happened with Oliver Cromwell, but Washington himself refused to be part of a military coup, and the colonial government, the Articles of Confederation, continued to be the government. But the Articles of Confederation could not raise money, which meant that the new country was bankrupt. They couldn't effectively pass laws because they required too many of the states to agree, and they couldn't raise their own army. So when a rebellion broke out in Massachusetts, known as Shays' Rebellion, the new government couldn't deal with this, and the Americans decided it was time to write a new document of government and replace the Articles of Confederation. This new government was written primarily by James Madison, but also others of the Founding Fathers, and was known as the Constitution. The Constitution divides power into three branches, sort of like Montesquieu would describe, or would ascribe to, and also within those branches divided up power into a variety of different places, including the two different houses of Congress and the various parts of the executive branch. And so because of this, the power is split amongst these different groups, each of which have checks and balances to make sure that no one group gets too powerful. So the Constitution is a perfect example of all of those Enlightenment principles because it also contains the Bill of Rights, which provides for things like freedom of speech and trial by jury, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. And so a lot of the values that we talked about in the Enlightenment end up showing up in this new Constitution. George Washington was the first president of the United States, and so he set up a whole variety of different practices that became more or less permanent parts of the American government. For example, he set up the idea that a president would only serve 2 terms, and he set up the idea that the president would create or would hire a series of people to help him run the government. And so Washington becomes the first president and provides an example of limited government. But at the same time, he also shows that the Constitution is more effective than the Articles, because when a rebellion broke out in Pennsylvania, known as the Whiskey Rebellion, Washington was able to raise an army and march out to put the rebellion down, showing that this new government could deal with problems more effectively than the Articles could. Finally, the new United States really came into its own after the War of 1812, which is part of a larger series of wars that we're going to be talking about next unit. But in the War of 1812, England went to war against the United States again, and in this, the Americans were able to both take control of the Ohio River Valley finally, by defeating the Native American tribes there, and they were able to defeat the British in the Battle of New Orleans, pictured here, giving Americans the sense that we'd finally come into our own, and even if England tries to come back and take us over, we could stand our ground against them, despite the fact that the British managed to also, in this war, burn the White House to the ground. But the War of 1812 has solidified our sense of ourselves as Americans. So this brings us back to our objectives for today. Hopefully you can provide some detail to answer these questions. And when we come back, we'll be moving back to Europe and talking about the effects of the French Revolution, which is one of the more important and central events in world history.